Good day, everyone. I am Haina Nadine San, a fourth-year Bachelor of Secondary Education major in English student. For today's presentation, I will be discussing Principles of Learning Objectives, which is part of Unit 3, Preparing for 21st Century Teaching, which is under ICT Integration, Emerging Trends, and Teacher-Learner and Interaction. But first, let us read our learning objectives. At the end of the lesson, students should be able to, for the knowledge, identify the principles of clear and effective lesson objectives. For our skill, construct a clear and appropriate learning objective for the assigned group activity by applying the principles of lesson objectives and identifying its audience, behavior, condition, and degree. For our affective, express the importance of writing clear and learner-centered lesson objectives by explaining how they can guide and support their role as future educators. Before we start, I want you to imagine something. Imagine that you are going to a place where you have never visited before, but you have no idea where you are going. You might say, okay, where do I go now? That is actually similar to what can happen in a lesson where there is no clear objective. So today, we are going to talk about how lesson objectives help give our lesson a clear direction. Now, what are we waiting for? Let's start. First is, what is a lesson objective? A lesson objective is a clear statement that tells us what students should be able to know, understand, or do by the end of the lesson. In very simple words, a lesson objective answers one important question. After this lesson, what should my students be able to do? For example, imagine that your lesson is about waste segregation. We could write our learning objectives like students will learn through waste segregation, but this is not very clear enough. What exactly should the students do? Instead, we can say students will demonstrate proper waste segregation. Now, we know what the students are expected to do. They need to demonstrate or show that they know how to properly segregate waste. So, a good lesson objective should not leave us guessing. It should give us a clear idea of the expected learning. We can also think about lesson objectives as a roadmap. When you travel, a roadmap or GPS helps you know where you are going. In the same way, a lesson objective helps the teacher and students know where the lesson is going. Now next is, why are lesson objectives important? Now you might be thinking, okay, I understand what an objective is, but the real question is, why is it really important? Well, lesson objectives are important because they give directions, guide activities, help measure learning, keep the lesson focused, and help students understand what is expected from them. Now let's make it easier. First, objective gives direction. They tell us what we are trying to accomplish. Second, they guide our activities. For example, if our objective says students should be able to demonstrate something, then our activity should allow them to actually practice and demonstrate that skill. Third is, objectives helps us measure our learning. We can look at an objective and ask, did my students actually achieve this? Fourth, objectives help the lesson focus. As future educators, we might have so many things we want to discuss, but we cannot discuss everything in one lesson. Now, the objective reminds us, okay, this is what my students need to achieve, so let's focus on this. And lastly, objectives help students understand what is expected from them. They know what they are supposed to learn or accomplish. So an easy way to remember this, the objectives tells us where to go, the activities helps us to get there, and the assessment checks if we reach our destination. Now let us move on to the first approach, which is SMART objectives. Now that we understand what the lesson objectives are, let us talk about one way of writing them. The first approach is the SMART objectives. SMART helps us make objectives that are clear, realistic, measurable, and connected to the lesson. SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Now let's go through them one by one. First is specific. Specific means that the objective should clearly tell us what students are supposed to do. For example, saying students will learn about the lesson objectives. It is too general, right? Instead, we can say students will identify the characteristics of an effective lesson objective. Now, it is clear what students need to do. They need to identify the characteristics. Next is measurable. This means we should be able to check if students actually achieve the objectives. For example, students will identify 4 characteristics of an effective lesson objective. Now we can give them an activity and check if they were able to identify the 4 characteristics. So, measurable simply means, can I check if they did it? Third is achievable. This means that the objective should be something students can realistically accomplish. For example, if we give students a very difficult task that would normally take 1 week, but we expect them to finish it in 5 minutes. That probably isn't very achievable, right? We need to consider the student's level, the time available, and the difficulty of the task. Fourth one is relevance. The objective should be connected to the lesson. For example, if our lesson is about writing objectives, Our objectives should be related to writing or understanding lesson objectives. It should have a purpose and help students reach the goal of the lesson. And lastly, time-bound. This means that the objective should have a specific time for completion. For example, by the end of the lesson, students will construct one clear learning objective. The phrase by the end of the lesson tells us when the students should accomplish that specific task. In conclusion, SMART objectives basically helps us make our lesson clear, realistic, useful, and easier to check. Now let's move on to another approach called the ABCD model. ABCD stands for audience, behavior, condition, and degree. It is simply a guide that helps us make sure our objectives contains the important information we need. Now let us use one example to make it easier to understand. Our objectives is, given a list of statements, grade 8 students will identify the correct learning domain with at least 80% accuracy. Now let's break it down. First is the audience. Audience simply means who will do the task. In our example, it is basically the grade 8 students. So grade 8 students are our audience. Next is the behavior. Behavior means what should the students do. In our example, the students will identify the correct learning domain. So identify is our behavior. Then comes condition. Condition simply means what are the students given or what situation will they be in when doing the task. In our example, the students are given a list of statements. So that is the condition. And lastly, we have the degree. The degree means how well should the students do the task. In our example, they should get at least 80% of accuracy. So that is the degree. Therefore, we can remember ABCD using our 4 simple questions. Audience, who will do the task? Behavior, what will the students do? Condition, what are they given or under what situation? And lastly, the degree, how well should they do it? And that's it. The ABCD model is basically helping us make our objectives more complete instead of just saying something general like students will learn about learning domains. Now let us move on to another important part, the 3 domains of learning. These are the cognitive, psychomotor, and the affective. These domains remind us that learning is not only about remembering information. Students can learn through thinking, doing, and developing positive attitudes and values. Now first is the cognitive domain. These focus on knowledge and thinking. It is about what students know, understand, and think about. For example, students will explain the importance of lesson objectives. The students are using their knowledge and thinking skills. So if the objective is mainly about thinking and understanding, it belongs to the cognitive domain. Next is the psychomotor domain. These focuses on physical skills. It is about what students can physically do or demonstrate. For example, students will demonstrate proper waste segregation. Here, students are not just talking about waste segregation. They are actually doing it. So, psychomotor domain is basically show me what you can do. And lastly, we have the affective domain. These focuses on students' attitudes, values, feelings, and interests. For example, students will show respect when listening to their classmates. These focuses on how students behave and what attitudes they show. So a very easy way to remember the 3 domains is cognitive is about thinking, psychomotor is about doing, and affective is about feeling and value. Now let's go to the 4 key principles of lesson objectives. These principles are important because they remind us what to consider when writing our objectives. Number 1 is key objectives should be learner-centered. This means we should focus on what the students will learn or do, not what the teacher will do. For example, instead of the teacher will explain the 3 domains, we can write students will identify the 3 domains. The teacher may still explain the topic, but the objective focuses on the students' learning. So, when writing an objective, ask, what will my students be able to do? Second is use precise action verbs. We should use precise action verbs because these words are clearly used to what students should do. Examples are identify, explain, compare, demonstrate, create, and evaluate. These words are better because we can observe or measure the actions. For example, we can check if a student can identify something or demonstrate a skill. Third one is state one objective per skill. We should state one objective per skill because one objective should focus on one specific skill or action. We should avoid putting too many different tasks into one objective because it can become confusing for both the teacher and the students. It is better to give each skill its own clear target. Lastly, match the level of the standards. We need to match the level of the standards because our objective should match what the curriculum or standard expects students to learn. For example, if students are expected to analyze something, our objective should not only ask them to memorize. The objective should be at the appropriate level of learning. In simple words, the objective should match what the students are actually expected to achieve. So after discussing all of these, we can see that lesson objectives are really important in teaching. They are not just something we write because they are required in a lesson plan. They help us know where the lesson is going, what students should achieve, what activities we should prepare, and how we can check their learning. And as future educators, having a clear objective can help us make our lesson more organized and meaningful for our students. So if there is one thing I want you to remember from this discussion, it is this. A clear objective gives a clear direction for learning. And that concludes my discussion on the principles of lesson objectives. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Once again, I am Haina Nadine San from BSED English 4. Have a great day, everyone!